Pluckley in Kent, one of the most picturesque villages in England. 11 years ago, it was the scene of one of the most brutal murders ever to take place in the south. The village falls neatly into two parts.
She was a small, little old lady with grey hair, very slim, very slight, about 5 feet tall. She was highly intelligent. She was very musical.
Miss Marshall had spent 45 years in Pluckley. Unlike her brothers, who had married or moved on, she chose to stay at Enfield Lodge, the family home, with its 6 acres of ground.
She worked before the war. After she took her degree, she worked with Dent's, the publishers, for a little while. And then I think when the war came, she looked after her parents. There wasn't much that was valuable there. Not really. Things had become rather run down and shabby as she'd become older. I suppose I'd call her, in a way, a distressed gentlefolk.
To people in Pluckley, however, Miss Marshall was something of a mystery, taking little part in village life. 17-year-old Peter Luckhurst was one of the few villagers she'd befriended.
Peter was a very likeable, quite cheeky boy, and I think people did know that his quality of life was quite poor, and people are quite kind and they wanted to help him. Peter's family stood out really very, very badly in Pluckley, which is a really quite middle-class village.
Luckhurst lived on the Thorne estate with his father and sister. His mother was at one time Miss Marshall's cleaning lady, until she died of TB when Luckhurst was 13. After that, he was a regular visitor at the lodge, doing odd jobs for the elderly woman in return for pocket money.
His mother died quite suddenly when he committed some minor offences in the village. He went to court a couple of times, and he was often in small trouble. They were all really quite minor things. I think he found a bicycle on the rubbish tip and was then accused of stealing that. Just small things.
On the 8th of October 1980, police were called to Enfield Lodge. They found blood in the sitting room, the bathroom, and smeared across the kitchen units. They found spots of blood in almost every room in the house. They followed the trail but found no sign of Miss Marshall. For 2 hours, police searched Enfield Lodge and its grounds. When they eventually broke the lock on the garden shed, they found her pinned to the ground with a hay fork through her neck. She had been bound, savagely beaten about the head, and her windpipe had been almost cut through. The local doctor called to the scene said at the time that her assailant would have a considerable amount of blood both on himself and his clothing. The scene in the shed appalled even the man who led the police inquiry, a veteran of many murder hunts.
At this time, on your own doorstep, you read it in the newspapers, it happens 7 days a week, but being half a mile from your own house, it's quite frightening.
On the day of the murder, Luckhurst was stopped by police as he cycled past the lodge. He told them he'd seen Miss Marshall's dog in the road earlier and he'd put it back over the gate. The police, however, were suspicious, and the next day he was taken to Ashford Police Station for questioning. After 2 hours, he confessed to attacking Miss Marshall. He was then questioned by officers about precisely what had happened. This is what he told them. He cycled up to the village post office in the morning to cash his cheque for Social Security arrears. He then cycled back down the hill and spent some time at home. At 11:30, he walked across the road to his local pub, the Spectre. He said he'd gone there with £12, but hardly had any money by the time he left. He said he played a few games of pool against friends and against his father, who came into the pub later with Luckhurst's sister. He also played on the fruit machine. He was drinking pints of light and mild. He said he started to drink Coca-Cola because he'd begun to feel lightheaded. At 2 o'clock he left the pub, collected his bike and cycled up Forge Hill towards Enfield Lodge. He said he'd had too much to drink, and it suddenly occurred to him to get more money from somewhere. When he reached the lodge, he left his bike a third of the way up the drive. The front door was open, so he walked straight in. Miss Marshall hadn't heard him come in, and at first didn't see him. He grabbed a log from beside the kitchen stove and attacked her with it.
What are you doing?
You got any money?
No!
He said he became angry and dragged her around the house in search of money. He took her upstairs first and went into the bedrooms. He said he couldn't remember whether there were 3 or 4 of them, but they went in them all and he couldn't find anything. Downstairs in the sitting room, in her handbag, he found a small wallet containing a checkbook.
There's nothing in here.
When he hit her a third time, she fell, but he grabbed her and dragged her into the kitchen. He said he lost his balance, and Miss Marshall fell against the kitchen units. He said she was sort of drowsy, as he half dragged her out of the back door to the garden shed. There, he tied her hands behind her back. He said he then gave her one hefty kick. He didn't know why. He just lashed out with his foot. He said he went all weird and started attacking her with a garden fork. But as he was beating it up and down, it knocked a hay fork, which fell down and stuck in the ground near Miss Marshall's neck. He said when he recovered from what he called his funny turn, he took the fork outside, locked the shed, and ran away. After giving the police this account, Luckhurst was charged with Miss Marshall's murder. It was less than 48 hours after her body had been found. The news shocked people in Pluckley.
To do that to somebody who's befriended him was just not Peter's nature. At the time we heard that Peter had been charged, we still couldn't believe that Peter could have done this, especially on his own. Peter was
Colwell with a friend.
I don't see how he could possibly have been so normal if he had committed that murder, or what would have happened to his clothes. He hadn't washed, he hadn't changed his clothes when he came to my house, and he still had the same clothes on when he was arrested.
According to police notes, even the officer who took Luckhurst's clothing from him at Ashford remarked on how little blood was on it. I
disbelieved that Peter could have had anything to do with it because of the violence of the crime. He wasn't really like he was 17-year-old, he was more like he was 14 years old. He was just a very small, he was a young boy still.
In fact, few villagers believed Luckhurst could have murdered for money the woman he described as like a mother to him.
It certainly wasn't for money, because at that time Peter had more money. He'd been doing some work and he'd had some other money, and he had more money at that time than he'd ever probably had before. He didn't need money. And he wasn't a very materialistic person anyway.
What's more, it was clear to many villagers that even after Luckhurst on his own could have committed the crime, the detective in charge of the investigation believed then and now that they got the right man.
I still say that Luckhurst was on his own when he committed this dreadful offence, and he showed no remorse whatsoever. He talked about culling foxes and rabbits, and that is my impression he thought that he was doing then. He admitted freely doing it, but won't face up to the fact that he did.
The evidence, it seemed, was overwhelming. After all, Detective Superintendent Spencer and his assistant, Chief Inspector Doug Harding, had in front of them someone who'd confessed to the crime, had described his method with extraordinary clarity, and had a motive.
I think he went there, he was after money, she hadn't got any, and he attacked her. She knew him, and he must have thought that if he left her, he would be identified, so he killed her.
And by the time the case came to court, the police forensic experts were able to show how Luckhurst's shoes and jacket had tiny spots of blood on them, which could have matched Miss Marshall's. On top of this, police were able to produce in court a knife which they found at Luckhurst's house. This, forensic evidence showed, was smeared with blood which matched Miss Marshall's blood type almost exactly. But one thing had changed. The man who admitted the crime had now withdrawn his confession. In a letter to his father from his prison cell, Luckhurst now claimed he had nothing to do with the murder, but had innocently stumbled on the body. This was his news story. After leaving the pub at 2 o'clock, bored and waiting for his sister to cook his lunch, he went for a bike ride. On the way up Forge Hill, as he passed Enfield Lodge, he saw a van and someone at the house. He carried on up the hill, but when he came back down, he noticed the van was gone. Still, with time on his hands, he decided to call in on Miss Marshall. He left his bike by the trees in the drive. The front door was open. He called her, but there was no answer.
Miss Marshall! Miss Marshall! Miss Marshall!
He picked up the log, wondering what it was doing in the hallway, but dropped it again when he saw what he thought was blood on it.
Miss Marshall?
Curious about where his friend was, he climbed over the board which stopped the dog going upstairs and looked in all the rooms.
Miss Marshall? Miss Marshall?
There appeared to be no sign of her. He said he thought she might have had a nosebleed.
Miss Marshall, you all right?
In the living room, he saw a checkbook in her handbag on a small coffee table. When he picked it up for a closer look, he noticed it too had blood on it. Then he found Miss Marshall's glasses on the floor near a pool of blood which was still wet and had soaked into the carpet. He said he picked up the glasses with the knife because he didn't want to leave his fingerprints. It was when he saw the blood in the sitting room that he thought something was wrong. Still holding the knife for his own protection, he searched the rest of the house. The blood he found in the kitchen, he said, looked as though someone had fallen against the sink unit and slid down it. He went into the garden and looked in the garage and greenhouse. In the unlocked shed, he found Miss Marshall lying on her front with a garden fork, which appeared to be stuck in the ground near her neck. He said he thought she may have just been unconscious, so he knelt over to see if she was still breathing. He saw the blood on the back of her head and prodded her in the back a few times with his knife to see if she moved. He said he then used it to move the blood-soaked collar of her coat and saw tiny puncture marks in her neck. He said he also tried to move her. Realizing she was dead, he panicked, locked the shed and ran away. He said he thought he'd slipped the knife into his pocket. So now, he claimed, he'd simply stumbled on the body. Scared that he might get the blame, he decided not to report what he'd found. Once in custody, he said he'd been able to give his account of the murder because he was simply being a good detective. He'd pieced together the details from the evidence he'd found at Enfield Lodge. At his trial at Maidstone Crown Court, 8 months after the murder, he pleaded not guilty. Even though the jury heard his second story, they chose to believe his earlier confession. It took just 2 hours for them to reach a unanimous verdict and find him guilty. After all, once in police custody, how else was Luckhurst able to explain so exactly what had happened to Miss Marshall? In part 2, we put his confession to the test, and we ask if there's a better explanation of how Miss Marshall met her death. "11 years later, his family, friends and villagers still complain that his conviction is unsafe.
Well, when I went to see Peter, I asked him if he did it, and he said no.
His confession has been called into question.
I was getting tired and giving up, and I couldn't be bothered anymore. So I thought, bugger it. And I told him I'd hit her with the log and left her in the house. I was trying again to tell him I hadn't killed her, just hit her on the head and left her in the house. Then he asked me who hit her with the fork, and I said it was me.
Police records confirm that all Luckhurst first admitted to was hitting Miss Marshall twice with the log. He was asked about the fork, which he only then admitted using. After that, he wrote his one-page confession. It was during further police questioning that Luckhurst gave more details of what was supposed to have happened. In his first story to the police, Luckhurst said he'd turned up at Enfield Lodge having had too much to drink. He was short of money. Several witnesses with him in the Spectre pub told police that he'd drunk only 1 or 2 pints of light and mild. Whether he was really short of money that day is also open to question. He'd cashed a social security cheque for £27 that morning, and he was expecting a further cheque the following day. Then there's the evidence at Enfield Lodge itself. These police photographs taken immediately after the incident show little evidence that the house had been ransacked in a search for money. Everything appears to be neat and tidy. Even the contents of Miss Marshall's handbag seem to have been left alone. Her TSB book, although it did have a small amount of blood on it, is still in place. Equally, could Luckhurst really have moved Miss Marshall around the house in the way that he described? Although she was less than 5 foot and weighed less than 7 stone, Luckhurst was equally slight. Explaining the trail of blood around the house, he told police he'd dragged Miss Marshall from room to room in the search for money. He then described how he had half carried, half dragged the old lady the 25 yards from the back door to the garden shed, yet no kind of mark was discovered on the ground. And if his confession is true, could Luckhurst have done this without his clothes being covered in Miss Marshall's blood? So why would Luckhurst confess to a crime he later said he didn't commit? Psychologists say that's not uncommon.
They kept on asking over and over again the same questions. I wasn't going to say anything that might help, so I just said that.
They confess basically in order to get out of an intolerable situation that they find very stressful. And the main thing is they can't cope, they want to get out of the police station, or they want the interview to terminate. And they confess for short-term immediate gains and do not consider sufficiently the long-term consequences of the confession that they made.
Peter said to me that he thought that one incident in particular in the village of Smarden, he confessed to scrap
Murder, his friends and family were shocked. The news was broken to his father by his solicitor.
When he told me Peter confessed.
Story that seemed to fit the facts so accurately.
Myself. It was all my own words, except that caution bit at the top. I made up what I said from what I seen in the house and what I put together myself. I'm a bloody good detective. They didn't tell me what happened, except that she'd been murdered.
The police were clearly relieved. The vicious and brutal killer of an elderly spinster is a seemingly insignificant wound to Miss Marshall's index finger.
It's a deep wound.
In the early days of the investigation. Asked by his solicitor 3 months after the killing, How he could account for the fact that the police had found a knife apparently stained with Miss Marshall's blood at his home, he denied all knowledge of it and couldn't remember using it in the attack. His pleasure. Later this year, he'll go before a parole board for the first time in 11 years. He'll be asked if he regrets killing Gwendolyn Marshall. He says he'll reply, how can he feel sorry for a crime he did not commit? His sentence is likely to continue.
Peter says that he didn't do it. He doesn't know who did it, but he did go there. But he will stay in prison as long as it takes. He doesn't want to come out of prison on parole having said that he did it. And he's very determined to do that. And he says it doesn't get harder in prison, it gets easier. And he's been in there this long and he's going to stay there unless he can be cleared.